The fluorescent lights above table 12 flickered with that familiar buzz that meant another 14-hour shift was finally winding down. Maria wiped down the mahogany surface for the third time, her shoulders aching from carrying heavy trays and her feet throbbing in the cheap shoes she could barely afford to replace. The upscale steakhouse where she worked attracted the kind of clientele who expected perfection with their $50 entrees, and tonight had been particularly brutal. A businessman at table 6 had snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog. The couple at table 9 sent back their wine twice, not because anything was wrong with it, but because they enjoyed watching her walk back and forth to the kitchen. And now, as she counted her tips in the dim light of the closing restaurant, Maria realized she had made barely enough to cover groceries for the week. I wonder how many of you watching this have ever felt completely invisible in your own life. Drop a comment below and let me know what state or country you are watching from, because this story of quiet strength is going to hit different depending on where you have seen this kind of dismissal happen in your own world. The drive home to their modest apartment took 20 minutes through streets that seemed to mock her exhaustion. David would be waiting, and Maria already dreaded the conversation she knew was coming. Her husband had that particular look lately, the one that meant he was building up to something big and unpleasant. She had seen it growing for weeks, lurking behind his morning coffee and evening complaints. Their apartment building stood in a neighborhood that could charitably be called transitional. The paint was peeling near the entrance, and the elevator made concerning noises, but the rent was manageable on David's corporate salary. At least, that was the story David told anyone who would listen. He worked as a mid-level operations manager at a logistics company, the kind of job that paid decent money but came with a decent amount of stress and a large amount of ego. Maria found him in the living room, tie loosened and jacket thrown over the back of their second-hand couch. He was scrolling through his phone with that expression she had learned to recognize, the one that meant he was composing complaints in his head. David looked up when she entered, and his face immediately shifted into the mixture of irritation and condescension that had become his default expression when looking at her. "You look tired," he said without any actual concern in his voice. "Another glamorous day serving food to people who actually matter, I suppose." Maria set her purse down carefully and moved toward the kitchen. "I had some difficult tables tonight, but the tips were decent. Mrs. Patterson asked about you. She mentioned they might have an opening in accounting if you are still interested in looking for something more professional." David laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. Professional, right? Because waiting tables at some wannabe fine dining place is the height of professionalism. Do you know what my colleagues say when they ask what my wife does for work? I have to tell them my wife is a waitress. A waitress, Maria. The word came out of his mouth like it left a bad taste. Maria began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator for a late dinner, keeping her movements calm and measured despite the familiar sting of his words. She had heard this speech before, in various forms, but lately it had been escalating into something sharper and more deliberate. "I work hard, David. I contribute to our household. The restaurant keeps me busy, and I bring home money every night." "Pocket change," David said, standing up and walking to the window. "Literal pocket change. Do you know how embarrassing it is for me when the guys at work talk about their wives? Johnson's wife is a marketing director. Peterson's wife runs her own consulting business. And what do I have to contribute to that conversation? My wife counts tips and asks people if they want dessert." Maria turned from the stove, wooden spoon still in her hand. "I never asked you to be embarrassed by my work. I have always been honest about what I do, and I have never been anything less than supportive of your career." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. David's face flushed, and he stepped closer with that particular aggressive posture that meant the conversation was about to turn nasty. "Supportive? You think bringing home $40 in crumpled bills is supportive? You think having to explain to my boss why my wife does not understand basic professional networking is supportive?" The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, and Maria found herself gripping the spoon tighter than necessary. She had learned over the years that engaging with David when he was in this mood only made things worse, but something about tonight felt different. There was an energy behind his anger that seemed more focused, more intentional. David walked to the small dining table where they kept their mail and important papers. He pulled out a manila folder that Maria had not seen before, thick with documents and official-looking papers. His movements had the deliberate quality of someone who had been planning this moment for quite some time. I have been thinking a lot lately about our situation, Maria, about where we are in life and where we are going. And I have come to the conclusion that this is not working anymore. Maria turned off the stove and gave him her full attention. The apartment suddenly felt very quiet, with only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. She could sense that whatever David was building up to, this was the moment everything would change. I want a divorce. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Maria set the spoon down on the counter and turned to face her husband fully. There was something in his posture that suggested he had been practicing this conversation, rehearsing the words and planning her reaction. David, if you are unhappy, we should talk about it. We should try counseling, or we should discuss what changes we need to make. Divorce does not have to be the first option. But David was shaking his head before she finished speaking. No, Maria. I am done talking. I am done pretending this is going to work. I am done being married to someone with no ambition, no drive, no vision for anything beyond the next tip she might earn. He opened the manila folder and spread several papers across the table. The documents looked official and expensive, the kind of paperwork that came from lawyers who charged by the hour and dressed better than most people could afford. I have already contacted an attorney. We have a meeting next Tuesday to discuss the division of assets and the terms of our separation. I think we can keep this simple and clean, since obviously our financial situation is pretty straightforward. Maria walked closer to the table, looking at the papers without touching them. Division of assets. The phrase sounded strange and formal, like something from a television show rather than her actual life. What assets are we dividing exactly? She asked. David laughed again, and this time it was even less pleasant than before. What assets? Maria, come on. What assets could we possibly have to divide? Your tip money? This apartment that I pay for? The car that I make payments on? The furniture we bought with my credit card? He gestured around the apartment with a dismissive wave. This is not exactly a complicated estate we are dealing with here. You keep whatever personal items you want. I keep everything that actually matters, and we both move on with our lives. You can find a nice studio apartment somewhere that fits your budget, and I can finally find someone who understands what it means to have real career goals. Maria felt something cold settle in her stomach. It was not fear, exactly, but something closer to a deep disappointment in how thoroughly David had misunderstood their entire relationship. There were so many things he did not know, so many conversations they had never had, so many assumptions he had made without ever bothering to ask questions. I think we should discuss this with lawyers present, she said quietly. Both of us should have proper representation before we make any major decisions. David waved his hand dismissively. If you want to waste money on a lawyer, that is your choice. But honestly, Maria, what is some bargain basement attorney going to tell you that you do not already know? This is simple math. I make the money. I pay the bills. I own the things that matter. You serve food and collect tips. The division of assets is going to reflect that reality. He began gathering the papers back into the folder, his movements quick and efficient like he was wrapping up a business meeting. The appointment is Tuesday at 10 in the morning. My lawyer's office is downtown. The address is on this card. Try not to be late. Maria took the business card he offered, looking at the expensive letterhead and the prestigious address. James Morrison, attorney at law. She recognized the firm name from advertisements and news articles. They were the kind of lawyers who represented corporate executives and real estate developers. As David walked toward their bedroom, he paused at the doorway and looked back at her with something that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. Maria, I know this seems harsh, but honestly, this is the best thing for both of us. You will be happier with someone more suited to your level of ambition. And I will be happier with someone who can actually contribute to a real future. After he disappeared into the bedroom, Maria stood alone in their small kitchen, looking at the business card and thinking about all the phone calls she would need to make in the morning. David had no idea what kind of future was about to unfold, but Maria was already planning exactly how Tuesday's meeting was going to go. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of gray sky that matched Maria's mood perfectly. She had spent the weekend making phone calls and organizing documents, preparing for what she knew would be a challenging meeting. David had been unusually cheerful around the apartment, humming while he shaved and whistling while he made his coffee, like a man who had finally solved a problem that had been bothering him for months. The law offices of Morrison, Whitfield and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise, the kind of building that announced its importance through marble lobbies and brass fixtures. Maria arrived 10 minutes early, carrying only a simple leather folder and wearing her best dress, which she realized looked modest and understated compared to the expensive suits flowing through the lobby. David was already there when she stepped off the elevator, standing next to a man who could only be James Morrison. The lawyer looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for the role of expensive attorney. Silver hair, perfectly tailored suit, and the kind of confident smile that came from winning cases for people who could afford to pay premium rates for premium results. Well, David said as Maria approached. Right on time. James, this is my wife Maria. Maria, this is James Morrison, the attorney I told you about. James extended his hand with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to managing delicate situations. Mrs. Castellanos, a pleasure to meet you. David has told me quite a bit about your situation. I think we can resolve this matter quickly and efficiently, with minimal stress for everyone involved. His handshake was firm but brief, and Maria noticed how his eyes automatically assessed her clothing, her posture, and her general demeanor in the space of about 3 seconds. She had been cataloged and categorized before the conversation even began. The conference room was designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a polished table that could seat 20 people. Maria felt deliberately small as she took the chair across from David and his lawyer, her simple folder looking almost comical next to the thick stack of documents James had prepared. Before we begin, James said, settling into his chair with practiced ease, I should mention that I typically recommend both parties have independent legal representation in matters like this. Mrs. Castellanos, do you have an attorney representing your interests? I do, Maria replied quietly. They should be arriving shortly. James nodded politely, but Maria caught the quick glance he exchanged with David. It was the kind of look that said they both doubted she could afford proper legal counsel, and they were prepared to take advantage of that situation. Well then, James continued, while we wait, perhaps David could outline his position so we can establish a framework for our discussion. David, would you like to explain your perspective on the assets in question? David leaned forward with the enthusiasm of a man who had been looking forward to this moment. James, this is really pretty straightforward. We have been married for 8 years, and during that time I have been the sole provider for our household. Maria works as a waitress at a local restaurant, which brings in some supplemental income, but nothing that could be considered a substantial contribution to our financial situation. He gestured toward Maria like she was an exhibit in a presentation. My salary covers our rent, our car payment, our utilities, our groceries, and basically every significant expense we have. Maria's tips might cover her personal expenses and maybe help with groceries occasionally, but we are talking about maybe $200 or $300 a week on a good week. James nodded thoughtfully, making notes on a legal pad with an expensive pen. And what are your expectations regarding asset division, given this financial dynamic? David smiled, and it was not a kind expression. I think fairness would suggest that I retain ownership of our major assets. The apartment lease is in my name, the car loan is in my name, and most of our possessions were purchased with my income. I am certainly willing to give Maria a reasonable amount of time to find her own housing, and I would not object to a small amount of temporary support while she gets established independently. Maria listened to this recital with growing amazement at how completely David had misunderstood their entire financial situation. Every assumption he was making was not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong in ways that would become obvious very soon. James turned to Maria with the patient expression of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. Mrs. Castellanos, I want to make sure you understand what we are discussing here. In community property situations, there are often complex calculations involved in determining fair division of assets. However, when one spouse has been the primary breadwinner and the other spouse has had limited income, the mathematics become relatively straightforward. He pulled out a document that looked like a financial worksheet. Based on the information David has provided, your total household assets appear to be relatively modest. The apartment you share, the vehicle, some household possessions, and perhaps some small savings accounts. Given the income disparity, a typical settlement might involve you receiving a portion of any savings, temporary spousal support, and reasonable time to establish independent housing. Maria opened her mouth to speak, but James continued without pausing. Now, I should mention that contesting these arrangements can be quite expensive from a legal standpoint. Divorce proceedings can drag on for months or even years, with attorney fees accumulating the entire time. Often, the most practical approach is to reach an amicable agreement quickly, particularly in situations where the financial picture is relatively clear-cut. David was nodding along like James was reciting obvious truths. That is exactly what I was thinking. Why make this complicated when the situation is so straightforward? Maria gets what she contributed, which is basically her personal belongings and maybe a small settlement to help her get started. I keep what I worked for and paid for. Clean, simple, and fair. The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Maria realized that both men had already decided how this conversation would go, and they were simply going through the motions of explaining it to her before presenting papers for her signature. James pulled out another set of documents. I have prepared a preliminary settlement agreement based on our initial discussion. Obviously, this would need to be reviewed by your attorney when they arrive, but I think you will find the terms quite reasonable given the circumstances. He slid the papers across the table toward Maria. In summary, you would have 60 days to find alternative housing, during which time David would continue to cover the apartment rent. You would receive a one-time settlement of $15,000, which represents a generous portion of the household savings plus a small amount of transitional support. David would retain ownership of the vehicle, since he makes the payments, and you would each keep your personal possessions. Maria looked at the papers without picking them up. The terms were not just insulting, they were based on such a fundamental misunderstanding of reality that she almost felt sorry for both men. David leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. I think that is more than fair, honestly. $15,000 is probably more money than Maria has ever had access to at one time. That should be enough to get a decent apartment and maybe buy a used car. She can get back on her feet pretty quickly with that kind of head start. James smiled indulgently. David has been quite generous in these terms, Mrs. Castellanos. Many breadwinners in similar situations might argue for a smaller settlement, given the limited financial contribution from the dependent spouse. The word dependent hung in the air like a slap. Maria realized that both men saw her as essentially a pet that David had been supporting out of kindness, and now they were negotiating the terms of her abandonment. I notice your attorney has not arrived yet, James continued, checking his expensive watch. If they are running late, we could certainly reschedule. However, if you would like to review these terms and ask any questions, I am happy to explain any aspects that might seem confusing. His tone suggested that most aspects would seem confusing to someone of her limited intellectual capacity. David was practically bouncing in his chair, clearly delighted with how smoothly everything was proceeding. You know what, James? I bet we could wrap this up today if Maria is reasonable about things. Her attorney probably is not going to tell her anything different than what you just explained. The math is pretty simple here. David turned to Maria with fake sympathy. Look, I know this is difficult, but think about it practically. You could fight this and spend months paying lawyer fees you cannot afford, just to end up with the same result. Or you could sign these papers today and start your new life with $15,000 in your pocket. That is a pretty good deal for someone in your situation. Maria set her hands flat on the table and looked directly at both men. I think it would be best if we waited for my representation to arrive before making any decisions about asset division. James exchanged another look with David. Mrs. Castellanos, I certainly respect your right to legal counsel. However, I would hate to see you waste money on prolonged legal proceedings when the outcome is so clear. Perhaps you could tell us who you have retained, so we can reach out to them directly and expedite this process? Before Maria could answer, there was a soft knock on the conference room door. A receptionist entered and announced that Patricia Wells from Wells, Harrison and Associates had arrived and was ready to join the meeting. Both David and James looked puzzled. David turned to Maria with a frown. Patricia Wells? I have never heard of her. Is she some kind of discount attorney? Maria stood as the receptionist showed in a woman who immediately transformed the entire atmosphere of the room. Patricia Wells was not just professionally dressed, she was expensively dressed in the way that communicated serious money and serious power. Her briefcase was leather that probably cost more than David made in a month, and her presence filled the room with the kind of authority that came from winning important cases for important people. James Morrison rose from his seat with the automatic respect that one elite attorney shows another. Patricia Wells. I should have realized. Mrs. Castellanos, you retained Patricia Wells? His voice had completely changed, and David was looking back and forth between the two attorneys with growing confusion and concern. Patricia Wells entered the conference room with the kind of presence that immediately shifted every dynamic in the space. She was not tall, but she carried herself with the absolute confidence of someone accustomed to being the most competent person in any room she entered. Her handshake with James Morrison was brief and professional, but Maria noticed how James straightened his posture and adjusted his tie unconsciously. Ms. Wells, James said, extending his hand with considerably more respect than he had shown Maria. I had no idea you were representing Mrs. Castellanos. This is certainly an unexpected development. Patricia smiled politely as she set her briefcase on the table and began removing documents. Mr. Morrison, a pleasure to see you again. I believe we worked opposite sides of the Hartwell estate case about 2 years ago. You represented the ex-husband's interests, if I recall correctly. The Hartwell case. David looked confused, but James clearly remembered it, and his expression suggested it had not ended well for his side. Patricia continued unpacking her materials with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and the sheer volume of paperwork emerging from her briefcase was becoming intimidating. David leaned toward James and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "How can she afford Patricia Wells? Do you know what someone like that charges per hour?" Patricia looked up from her documents with the patient expression of a teacher addressing a slow student. Mr. Castellanos, my fee arrangements with my client are confidential, but I can assure you that Mrs. Castellanos' compensation for my services is quite adequate. She pulled out a thick folder that dwarfed the simple paperwork James had prepared. Her materials were organized with colored tabs, indexed sections, and the kind of meticulous preparation that suggested months of careful research rather than a hasty consultation. Now then, Patricia said, settling into her chair and opening her first binder, I have reviewed the preliminary settlement terms that Mr. Morrison provided to my client, and I must say, I found them quite interesting from a legal perspective. James straightened in his chair, clearly recognizing that the tone of this meeting had changed completely. The settlement reflects what we believe to be a fair division of assets based on the financial contributions of each party during the marriage. Patricia nodded thoughtfully, making notes on a legal pad. I see. And your assessment of financial contributions was based on what specific documentation? Income tax returns, perhaps? Property records? Investment statements? Well, James said, beginning to sound less certain, we based our assessment on Mr. Castellanos' employment history and Mrs. Castellanos' work as a service industry employee. Patricia looked up with polite interest. I see. So you did not review any property ownership records? Any business filings? Any investment portfolios or trust documentation? David interrupted with growing irritation. Investment portfolios? Trust documentation? James, what is she talking about? Maria works at a restaurant. She brings home tips in a coffee can. What kind of investment portfolio could she possibly have? Patricia turned her attention to David with the kind of focus that made him immediately uncomfortable. Mr. Castellanos, during your marriage, did you ever ask your wife about her work before you met? Her educational background? Her family financial situation? David looked confused by the question. Of course I know about her background. She grew up working class, dropped out of community college, worked various service jobs until we met. There is nothing mysterious about Maria's situation. Patricia made more notes, and her expression suggested she was documenting something important. And when she told you she was working at the restaurant, did you ever visit her workplace? Meet her supervisors? Review her pay stubs or tax documentation? Why would I need to do any of that? David was getting defensive now. I knew what she made because I saw what she brought home. Tips and maybe some hourly wages. It is not exactly complicated. Patricia pulled out a different folder and began removing what appeared to be official documents with government seals and notarized signatures. Mr. Castellanos, I am curious about your understanding of property ownership during your marriage. For instance, the apartment where you currently reside. You mentioned that the lease is in your name? David looked to James for support. That is correct. I have been paying the rent for 8 years. The lease agreement is in my name, and I make the monthly payments from my checking account. Patricia nodded and made another note. And you never wondered why the rent was so reasonable for such a desirable location? Or why your lease applications were processed so quickly despite what I imagine was a fairly typical credit score for someone your age? James was beginning to look uncomfortable. Ms. Wells, I am not sure where you are going with this line of questioning. Property rental agreements are fairly straightforward matters. Patricia smiled and pulled out a document that she placed on the table where everyone could see it. This is a property deed filed with the county recorder office. It shows ownership of the building located at 247 Maple Street, which I believe is where Mr. and Mrs. Castellanos currently reside. She pointed to a specific line on the document. The property owner is listed as Castellanos Holdings LLC, which was established 8 years ago, just before Mr. and Mrs. Castellanos were married. David leaned forward to look at the document, his face showing confusion rather than understanding. I do not understand what this has to do with anything. Some company owns our building. So what? Patricia pulled out another document. This is the corporate filing for Castellanos Holdings LLC. The sole owner and managing member is listed as Maria Elena Castellanos. The silence that followed this statement was profound. David stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language, while James Morrison began to realize that he had walked into a situation far more complex than anyone had prepared him for. That cannot be right, David said finally. Maria does not own anything. She is a waitress. She brings home tips. How could she own the building we live in? Patricia began spreading additional documents across the table with the systematic precision of someone building an unshakable case. Mr. Castellanos, when you made your monthly rent payments, where exactly did that money go? David looked confused by the question. I wrote checks to Maple Street Properties. That is the management company for our building. Patricia produced another document. Maple Street Properties is a subsidiary of Castellanos Holdings LLC. Your rent checks have been deposited into an account controlled by your wife for the past 8 years. David's face went through several different expressions as he tried to process this information. James Morrison was frantically taking notes, clearly realizing that his preliminary research had been completely inadequate. This is impossible, David said, his voice rising. Maria does not have money to buy buildings. She does not have money to buy anything. I have seen her count tips on our kitchen table every night for 8 years. Patricia looked at Maria, who nodded slightly, giving her permission to continue. Mr. Castellanos, did it ever occur to you to ask your wife what she did with those tips? Or why she never seemed to need any of your money for personal expenses despite working what you assumed was a low-paying job? Maria spoke for the first time since Patricia had arrived, her voice calm and clear. David, you never asked me about my work beyond what you assumed it was. You never asked about my family, my education, or my plans. You saw what you expected to see and never looked any deeper. David turned to stare at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. What are you talking about? I know everything about you. We have been married for 8 years. Patricia consulted another folder. Mrs. Castellanos, would you like to explain to your husband about your educational background and professional experience? Maria straightened in her chair, and suddenly her entire posture changed. The quiet, submissive woman who had been enduring David's condescension was replaced by someone who looked comfortable with authority and confident in her own competence. David, I have a master's degree in business administration from Northwestern, with a concentration in real estate development and property management. I started my first investment company when I was 25, 3 years before we met. The restaurant where you think I work as a waitress is actually one of 7 establishments I own in this city. The silence in the conference room stretched for almost 30 seconds as David processed what Maria had just told him. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, while James Morrison frantically shuffled through his own papers as if hoping to find something that would make sense of this situation. Patricia Wells continued her methodical presentation without acknowledging the shock she had just delivered. She pulled out a thick binder with organized tabs and began turning pages with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. Let us begin with the property portfolio, she said, extracting a series of official documents. Mrs. Castellanos, would you prefer to walk through these systematically, or shall I present them chronologically by acquisition date? Maria looked directly at David as she answered. Chronologically would be fine, Patricia. I think it would help David understand how long this has been going on. Patricia opened to the first tab and placed a deed on the table. The first property acquisition was made in 2018, 1 year before your marriage. This is a 4-unit apartment building on Cedar Street, purchased for $450,000, now valued at approximately $1.2 million. She placed a second deed next to the first. 6 months later, Mrs. Castellanos acquired a small office complex on 3rd Avenue for $600,000. Current market value is approximately $1.8 million. David stared at the documents like they might disappear if he looked at them hard enough. This is insane. Maria, where did you get $600,000? You were working at that little cafe when we met. You drove a car that was falling apart. Maria smiled slightly, and for the first time since the meeting began, she looked genuinely amused. David, that little cafe was mine. I bought it when I was 26 and spent 2 years learning the restaurant business from the ground up. The car was falling apart because I was reinvesting every dollar I made instead of spending money on things that did not generate income. Patricia continued laying out deeds like she was dealing cards. Third acquisition, made 6 months after your marriage. The Maple Street property, where you currently live. Purchase price was $800,000 for the entire building, which contains 12 units plus commercial space on the ground floor. James Morrison finally found his voice. Ms. Wells, I need to verify these documents. This is completely contrary to the financial picture that was presented to me by my client. Patricia reached into her briefcase and produced a different folder. Mr. Morrison, I have copies of all relevant tax returns, corporate filings, and property records going back 10 years. I also have verification letters from 3 different accounting firms and 2 banks. Would you like me to provide contact information so you can confirm authenticity? David looked like he was having trouble breathing. Maria, this does not make sense. If you owned our building, why did I pay rent every month? Why did you let me think I was supporting us? Maria's expression became more serious. David, you never asked where the rent money went. You wrote a check every month to Maple Street Properties and assumed that meant you were paying our landlord. It never occurred to you to wonder why our rent was $300 less than comparable units in the neighborhood, or why our lease applications were always approved immediately. Patricia placed another deed on the growing pile. Fourth acquisition, made 18 months after your marriage. This is the Riverside Shopping Plaza, purchased for $2.4 million. Current value is approximately $4.1 million. She paused to make a note on her legal pad. Mrs. Castellanos financed this purchase through a combination of accumulated rental income and a business loan secured by her existing properties. The loan was paid off in full last year. David turned to stare at Maria like she was a stranger who had wandered into his life by mistake. You bought a shopping plaza? Maria, I had no idea you even knew what a shopping plaza was. Maria leaned forward slightly, and her voice carried a tone that David had never heard from her before. It was patient but firm, like someone explaining something obvious to a child. David, every weekend for 8 years, you thought I was visiting my sister or running errands. I was actually meeting with property managers, reviewing financial statements, and conducting site inspections. The papers you saw me working on at the kitchen table were not bills and grocery lists. They were lease agreements and maintenance reports. Patricia opened another tab in her binder. Fifth acquisition, made 3 years after your marriage. This is the downtown office building known as Commerce Plaza. Purchase price was $6.2 million, financed through a commercial real estate loan. Current market value is approximately $11.5 million. James Morrison was writing frantically, apparently trying to calculate numbers that kept growing beyond his comprehension. Ms. Wells, are you telling me that Mrs. Castellanos has been managing a real estate portfolio worth over $20 million while her husband believed she was working as a waitress? Patricia consulted her notes. Mr. Morrison, we are currently at approximately $19.6 million in confirmed property values, and we have only covered the first 5 acquisitions. Mrs. Castellanos has been quite active in the real estate market over the past decade. David's voice came out as almost a whisper. Maria, the restaurant where you work. You said you own 7 restaurants. What does that mean exactly? Maria straightened in her chair, and David could see a confidence in her posture that he realized had probably always been there. hidden under the submissive behavior she had learned to display around him. The restaurant where you have seen me working is called Bella Vista. I purchased it 4 years ago from the original owner, who was retiring. I kept working the floor because I believe in understanding every aspect of my businesses from the ground up. Patricia placed another set of documents on the table. The restaurant portfolio includes Bella Vista, which Mrs. Castellanos purchased for $800,000, now valued at $1.4 million. There is also Rosewood Bistro, purchased for $1.1 million, current value $1.9 million. Garden Court Cafe, purchased for $600,000, current value $1.2 million. She continued laying out restaurant purchase agreements and current valuation reports. Harborview Grill, purchased for $1.8 million, current value $3.2 million. The Metropolitan, purchased for $2.4 million, current value $4.1 million. Riverside Tavern, purchased for $900,000, current value $1.6 million. And finally, Sunset Steakhouse, purchased for $1.3 million, current value $2.3 million. David was staring at the table, which was now covered with more financial documents than he had seen in his entire life. The numbers were so large that they seemed abstract, like figures from a news article about someone else's life rather than his own reality. "Maria," he said slowly, "when you brought home tips every night, what was that actually from?" Maria exchanged a look with Patricia before answering. "David, I was not bringing home tips. I was bringing home cash deposits from the daily operations of whichever restaurant I had visited that day. When you saw me counting money on our kitchen table, I was preparing the daily deposits for my business accounts." James Morrison had stopped taking notes and was simply staring at the documents spread across the table. "Ms. Wells, what is the current total valuation of Mrs. Castellanos' property and business holdings?" Patricia consulted a summary sheet that looked like it had been prepared by a team of accountants. Based on current market assessments and recent comparable sales, the real estate portfolio is valued at approximately $34.7 million. The restaurant businesses, including equipment, goodwill, and projected earnings, add approximately another $8.4 million in value. She looked up from her calculations. "We are currently at $43.1 million in confirmed assets, and we have not yet discussed Mrs. Castellanos' investment accounts, retirement funds, or liquid assets." David made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. $43 million. "Maria, you are worth $43 million, and you let me lecture you about bringing home tip money." Maria's voice was gentle but implacable. "David, you never asked. In 8 years of marriage, you never once asked me about my goals, my education, my family background, or my business interests. You saw a woman working in a restaurant and assumed that was the limit of my capabilities. You created a story about who I was and what I was worth, and you never bothered to find out if that story was true." Patricia Wells opened another section of her binder, this one marked with a red tab that suggested the contents were particularly significant. "Mr. Morrison, we have covered Mrs. Castellanos' domestic real estate holdings, but we have not yet addressed her international investments or her equity positions in various business ventures." David looked like he was experiencing some form of shock. His face had gone pale, and he kept looking back and forth between Maria and the growing pile of financial documents, as if he could make them disappear through sheer disbelief. "International investments?" he repeated weakly. "Maria, you have international investments?" Maria nodded calmly. "David, when I told you I was taking weekend trips to visit my college roommate in Chicago, I was actually flying to Toronto to inspect a property development project. When you thought I was attending cooking classes, I was meeting with investment advisors about European real estate opportunities." Patricia placed a new set of documents on the table. "Mrs. Castellanos owns a 40% stake in a luxury resort development in Costa Rica, valued at approximately $8.2 million. She also holds property interests in a commercial district revitalization project in Dublin, Ireland, currently valued at $6.4 million. James Morrison was frantically calculating figures on his legal pad, apparently trying to keep track of numbers that kept escalating beyond anything he had prepared for. "Ms. Wells, are we to understand that Mrs. Castellanos has been conducting international business while her husband believed she was taking recreational weekend trips?" Patricia consulted her notes. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Castellanos has been quite strategic about compartmentalizing her business activities. She found it easier to pursue her professional interests without having to constantly correct misconceptions about her capabilities. David turned to stare at Maria with an expression of complete bewilderment. Maria, those cooking classes you said you were taking, what were you actually doing? Maria smiled slightly. David, I was attending board meetings for the Restaurant Association and meeting with potential investors for expansion projects. The cooking classes story seemed simpler than explaining that I was considering acquiring a chain of Italian restaurants in 3 different states. Patricia opened another folder. Speaking of restaurant chains, Mrs. Castellanos currently owns controlling interests in 2 regional restaurant groups beyond her individual establishments. The first is Coastal Dining Group, which operates 14 restaurants along the eastern seaboard. Mrs. Castellanos acquired her 51% stake for $12.8 million 3 years ago. She placed another document on the table. The second is Mountain View Hospitality, which operates 9 restaurants and 2 hotels in Colorado and Utah. Mrs. Castellanos purchased her 60% ownership position for $18.4 million 2 years ago. David made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a whimper. Maria, when you said you were visiting your sister in Denver, you were buying hotels? Maria's voice remained patient but firm. David, my sister lives in Connecticut, not Denver. And yes, I was acquiring hospitality properties. I also purchased a small ski resort near Vail that same trip, but we can discuss that later. James Morrison set down his pen and looked directly at Patricia. Ms. Wells, I think I need to ask directly. What is the total value of Mrs. Castellanos' business and investment portfolio? Patricia pulled out what appeared to be a comprehensive financial statement prepared by a major accounting firm. Mr. Morrison, based on current market valuations and certified appraisals, Mrs. Castellanos' total asset portfolio is valued at approximately $79.8 million. The silence that followed this statement was absolute. David stared at the financial statement like it contained information that violated the laws of physics. James Morrison set down his expensive pen and pushed his chair back from the table. $79.8 million, James repeated slowly. Mrs. Castellanos, you are worth nearly $80 million. Maria nodded. That figure is based on conservative valuations. Some of my properties are in rapidly appreciating markets, so the actual number may be higher by the time we complete this divorce proceeding. David finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Maria, I do not understand. How is this possible? How did you accumulate this kind of wealth without me knowing anything about it? Maria leaned forward slightly, and for the first time since the meeting began, she looked directly at David with something that might have been sympathy. David, you never asked because you never thought I was capable of anything beyond serving food and counting tips. Every time I tried to discuss business or finances, you would pat me on the head and tell me not to worry about things I did not understand. She gestured toward the documents spread across the table. When I mentioned that I was thinking about investing in real estate, you told me to focus on learning to cook better meals. When I suggested we look into refinancing our apartment, you said that financial planning was too complicated for someone with my background. You created a version of me in your head, and you never allowed the real me to exist in our relationship. Patricia opened yet another folder. Mrs. Castellanos, shall we discuss the documentation regarding Mr. Castellanos' personal expenses and investments? David looked confused. What documentation? I do not have any investments. I have a savings account and a retirement fund through my company. Patricia placed a bank statement on the table. Mr. Castellanos, this shows a deposit of $25,000 into your personal savings account 3 years ago. Do you recall where that money came from? David studied the statement, looking genuinely puzzled. That was my bonus that year. I had a really good performance review, and the company gave me a substantial bonus. Patricia placed another document next to the bank statement. This is a wire transfer record showing $25,000 transferred from Castellanos Holdings LLC to your personal account on the same date. The transfer was authorized by Mrs. Castellanos and listed as spousal support. David's mouth fell open. Maria, you gave me that money? But my boss said it was a performance bonus. Maria's expression remained calm. David, your boss called me to ask if we could manage without your salary for a month because the company was having cash flow problems. I told him that would be fine, and I arranged for the bonus payment myself, so you would not have to worry about money or feel embarrassed at work." James Morrison was shaking his head slowly. "Mrs. Castellanos, are you saying that you have been financially supporting your husband without his knowledge?" Patricia consulted another section of her binder. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Castellanos has provided financial assistance to her husband on numerous occasions. The car he believes he purchased with an auto loan was actually financed through one of Mrs. Castellanos' business accounts. The promotion he received 2 years ago came after Mrs. Castellanos made a significant donation to his company's charity fund, which helped secure several major contracts." David was staring at Maria like she was someone he had never met before. "Maria, you bought my car? You helped me get promoted? How much of my life have you been quietly managing without telling me?" Maria's voice carried a note of sadness that had not been there before. "David, I have been trying to support your dreams and protect your ego for 8 years. Every time you worried about money, I made sure the bills were paid. Every time you wanted something you could not afford, I found a way to make it happen without making you feel dependent. I thought I was being a good wife by letting you feel successful and independent." Patricia pulled out one final document, thick with official seals and notarized signatures. Mrs. Castellanos also kept detailed records of her husband's behavior and statements regarding her perceived financial dependence. "Mr. Morrison, this documentation includes recorded conversations, written communications, and witness statements covering approximately 6 years of systematic dismissal and financial condescension." David's face went from pale to red. "You recorded our conversations? Maria, you recorded me talking to you in our own home?" Maria's voice remained steady. "David, I recorded you explaining to your friends and family that I was too stupid to understand money, too lazy to have real ambitions, and too dependent to survive without your financial support. I documented every time you introduced me as just a waitress, every time you told people I brought home tip money, and every time you suggested that supporting me was an act of charity on your part." James Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Wells, what kind of settlement is your client seeking in this matter?" Patricia began organizing her documents with the same methodical precision she had used to present them. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Castellanos is seeking a settlement that reflects the actual financial contributions made by each party during this marriage. Given that she provided the housing, transportation, and occasional income supplementation for her husband, while building a business empire valued at nearly $80 million, we believe a fair settlement would award her the entirety of her premarital and business assets, plus compensation for the financial support she provided to Mr. Castellanos over the course of their marriage." David's voice cracked as he spoke. "Compensation? Maria, you want me to pay you back?" Maria looked at him with an expression that was both sad and resolute. "David, I want you to understand that this marriage has been a financial loss for me from the beginning. I want you to understand that every dollar you thought you were generously providing for our household was actually money I had given you. And I want you to understand that your assumption that I needed your support was not just wrong. It was the exact opposite of our actual situation." Maria stood up from her chair with a fluid movement that seemed to transform her entire presence in the room. The quiet, submissive woman who had endured David's condescension was completely gone, replaced by someone who looked perfectly comfortable wielding the kind of authority that came with controlling $80 million in assets. "Patricia," she said, her voice carrying a tone of command that David had never heard before, "I think we can proceed with outlining my settlement terms now." David was still staring at the financial documents spread across the table, apparently trying to process the magnitude of what he had just learned. James Morrison was frantically reviewing his notes, clearly realizing that everything he had prepared for this meeting was not only useless, but potentially embarrassing to his professional reputation. Maria walked to the window overlooking the city, her posture straight and confident. "For 8 years, David, you have told me that I was lucky to have you supporting me. You have explained to your friends, your family, and anyone who would listen that you were generously providing for a wife who contributed nothing to our household except occasional tip money and domestic services." She turned back to face the table, and David could see that her entire demeanor had shifted into something that looked like a corporate executive addressing a board meeting. "You have dismissed my intelligence, mocked my education, and treated my work as if it were a hobby that you tolerated out of kindness. You have made it clear that you consider me a financial burden and an embarrassment to your professional reputation. Patricia opened a new folder and began removing documents that looked official and final. Mrs. Castellanos, shall I present the settlement terms as we discussed them? Maria nodded. Yes, Patricia. I think it is time for David to understand what his assumptions about my financial dependence are going to cost him. James Morrison cleared his throat nervously. Ms. Wells, before we proceed, I think my client and I should discuss the implications of these revelations. Perhaps we could request a brief recess to evaluate our position. Maria smiled, and it was not a warm expression. Mr. Morrison, your client has had 8 years to evaluate our financial position. He chose to make assumptions instead of asking questions. I see no reason to give him additional time to adjust his expectations now that those assumptions have proven to be spectacularly wrong. Patricia placed a document titled Settlement Agreement on the table. Mrs. Castellanos will retain full ownership of all properties, businesses, and investments acquired before and during the marriage, as they represent her separate property and the fruits of her individual labor and expertise. David started to speak, but Maria held up her hand in a gesture that immediately silenced him. The gesture was small, but it carried absolute authority, and David found himself obeying without thinking about it. Additionally, Maria continued, you will have 30 days to vacate the apartment on Maple Street. Your lease with Castellanos Holdings LLC will be terminated, as I have decided to convert that building to upscale condominiums. The rental income from those units will be significantly higher than what I was charging you out of misplaced marital consideration. David's voice came out as barely a whisper. Maria, where am I supposed to live? I cannot afford downtown rent on my actual salary. Maria's expression remained impassive. David, that is the kind of problem that adults solve for themselves. I suggest you begin looking for housing that fits within your actual means rather than housing that depends on subsidies from a wife you considered financially inferior. Patricia continued reading from the settlement document. Mr. Castellanos will return the vehicle currently in his possession, as the loan payments were made through Mrs. Castellanos' business accounts and the title is held by one of her companies. But I need that car for work, David protested. Maria, you cannot just take my car away. Maria walked back to the table and sat down, fixing David with a direct stare that he found impossible to meet. David, it was never your car. For 3 years, you have been driving a vehicle owned by my company while believing that you purchased it through your own financial efforts. The illusion of ownership does not create actual legal rights. James Morrison was writing frantically, apparently trying to find some legal foundation for protecting his client's interests. Ms. Wells, surely there must be some consideration for the emotional and practical disruption this will cause Mr. Castellanos. He has built his life around certain assumptions about his financial situation. Patricia looked up from her documents with the patient expression of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. Mr. Morrison, your client built his life around false assumptions that he never bothered to verify. Mrs. Castellanos has no legal obligation to continue enabling those delusions simply because correcting them is inconvenient for him. Maria opened her own folder and removed a thick stack of papers that looked like they had been prepared by a private investigator. David, I want you to understand something important about our marriage. Every condescending comment you made about my intelligence, every dismissive remark about my capabilities, every time you introduced me as just a waitress, I documented it. She began laying out photographs and printed transcripts. This is you at the company Christmas party 3 years ago, explaining to your colleagues that your wife was too simple to understand basic financial concepts. This is you at your brother's wedding, telling your family that marriage to me was an act of charity because I would never be able to support myself independently. David's face was turning red as he recognized his own words in the transcripts. Maria, you cannot use private conversations against me. Those were just things people say. I did not mean them seriously. Maria's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the quiet tone. David, you said them seriously enough that you repeated them consistently for years. You said them seriously enough that you based our entire divorce strategy on the assumption that they were true. And you said them seriously enough that your lawyer prepared settlement documents treating me like a financially dependent spouse who should be grateful for minimal support. Patricia placed another document on the table. Mrs. Castellanos also documented the financial manipulation and emotional abuse that accompanied these statements. Mr. Morrison, your client systematically undermined his wife's confidence while secretly benefiting from her financial support. This pattern of behavior has been thoroughly documented and witnessed. James Morrison was beginning to look desperate. Ms. Wells, surely we can reach some compromise that acknowledges the practical realities of Mr. Castellanos' situation. He has been operating under the assumption that he was the primary breadwinner. Some transition period would be reasonable. Maria leaned forward slightly, and her voice carried a tone that David had never heard from her before. It was the voice of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of dollars and hundreds of employees. Mr. Morrison, your client had 8 years to learn about his wife's actual situation. He chose to remain ignorant because ignorance supported his preferred narrative about his own importance. The practical realities of his situation are entirely of his own making. Patricia consulted her notes. Mrs. Castellanos is willing to provide a one-time payment of $5,000 to assist with Mr. Castellanos' transition to independent living. This payment represents more financial support than Mr. Castellanos actually provided to the household during their marriage, so it should be considered quite generous under the circumstances. David's voice cracked as he spoke. $5,000. Maria, I cannot start over with $5,000. I am 40 years old. I have no savings, no assets, and now no place to live. You cannot just throw me away after 8 years of marriage. Maria's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained absolute. David, you spent 8 years treating me like I was disposable. You planned to divorce me because you were embarrassed by my perceived lack of ambition. You offered me $15,000 and told me it was more money than someone like me had ever seen at one time. The settlement I am offering you is proportional to the actual contribution you made to our marriage, not the contribution you imagined you were making. James Morrison made one last desperate attempt. Ms. Wells, this seems punitive rather than equitable. Mr. Castellanos may have been mistaken about the financial dynamics of his marriage, but surely that does not justify leaving him essentially destitute. Patricia gathered her documents with the efficiency of someone who had thoroughly won a case. Mr. Morrison, your client spent years telling everyone who would listen that his wife was a financial burden who could never survive without his support. Mrs. Castellanos' settlement terms simply give him the opportunity to prove whether those statements applied more accurately to him than to her. Maria stood again and walked to where David was sitting. She looked down at him with an expression that contained no anger, only a kind of businesslike finality. David, you have 30 days to sign these papers and vacate my property. If you choose to contest this settlement, you will be responsible for both your legal fees and mine, and the final terms will likely be less favorable to you than what I am offering now. She paused for a moment, studying his face. 8 years ago, you married a woman you thought was beneath you financially and intellectually. Today, you learn that you were completely wrong about both assessments. The question now is whether you are capable of learning from that mistake or whether you will continue to make the same kinds of assumptions about people and situations you do not understand. David tried one more time, his voice desperate and pleading. Maria, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. I can change. I can appreciate what you have accomplished. We do not have to get divorced. Maria's smile was sad but final. David, you did not fall in love with me. You fell in love with a version of me that you created in your imagination. You wanted a wife who would be grateful for your support and impressed by your success. You never wanted a wife who might be more successful than you were. The real me has been here all along, but you chose not to see her because she did not fit the story you wanted to tell about yourself. She walked back to her chair and began packing her own papers. The woman you married owns $80 million in assets and employs over 300 people across multiple states. She speaks 3 languages, holds advanced degrees from 2 universities, and has built a business empire while maintaining the fiction that she was dependent on your support. That woman deserves a partner who respects her intelligence and appreciates her capabilities, not someone who treats her like a charity case. David signed the settlement papers with shaking hands. His earlier arrogance completely collapsed into desperate resignation. James Morrison advised him quietly that fighting the terms would be financially ruinous and professionally embarrassing, given how thoroughly he had misunderstood his own situation. 3 months later, Maria stood in the penthouse office of her newest acquisition, a downtown high-rise that she had purchased and renovated into luxury condominiums. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the city she had been quietly conquering one property at a time for over a decade. Her assistant knocked and entered with the day's reports. The restaurant division was showing record profits. The real estate portfolio had appreciated by another $12 million, and the new hotel in Costa Rica was booked solid through the following year. Maria reviewed the numbers with the same careful attention to detail that had built her empire, while everyone around her assumed she was just counting tip money. She had heard through mutual friends that David was sharing a studio apartment with a roommate and taking the bus to work since losing his car. He had applied for several jobs that would pay more than his current position, but his lack of actual assets and independent financial history had made it difficult to present himself as the successful executive he had always believed himself to be. Maria felt no particular satisfaction in his struggles, but she felt no guilt either. David had created his own problems by choosing comfortable assumptions over uncomfortable truths. She had simply stopped enabling those assumptions and allowed reality to show him what his life actually looked like without her quiet support. That evening, Maria returned to Bella Vista, the restaurant where David had assumed she worked as a waitress. She walked through the dining room, greeting regular customers who had watched her build her business from a struggling neighborhood cafe into one of the city's most successful establishments. Several of her employees approached her with questions about scheduling and suppliers, and she handled each issue with the calm competence that had made her restaurants profitable when other businesses in the area were closing. As she reviewed the night's receipts in her office, Maria reflected on how different her life felt now that she no longer had to pretend to be someone smaller and simpler than she actually was. For 8 years, she had worn the mask of a dependent wife because she thought it would make David feel more secure and confident. Instead, it had enabled him to become arrogant and dismissive, treating her like a burden rather than a partner. She thought about viewers who might be watching this story unfold and wondering about their own relationships and assumptions. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone completely underestimated your capabilities or dismissed your potential? Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone's ego and showing your true strength? Let me know in the comments how this story resonated with your own experiences, because the truth is that we all have hidden depths that the people closest to us sometimes refuse to see. The lesson, Maria realized, was not about revenge or financial punishment. It was about the importance of seeing people clearly and treating them with respect for who they actually are rather than who you assume them to be. David had lost everything not because Maria was cruel, but because he had built his life on a foundation of willful ignorance that could not survive contact with reality. Maria turned off the lights in her office and walked out into the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to build and create and grow. She was finally free to be herself completely, without having to minimize her success to make someone else feel better about their own limitations. And for the first time in 8 years, that felt like exactly the life she was meant to be living.